Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And as you know, the Diversity Connector brings you interesting people from all over the world, shining a lens on the power and the fascination of diversity. It gives me great pleasure to bring on board my next guest. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Gertrude, for a wonderful opportunity to meet with you and share my story. My name's Kathy Karatasas. My Greek name is Ekaterini Karatasas, and over time I had changed my name to become a bit more acculturated, as I thought would be helpful. I live in Sydney with three of my adult children. I have Greek background, Greek heritage. I'm a second generation migrant, one of four children too, and have, as I said, three children that live with me and another one that doesn't in the Greek tradition. I am a social worker by my qualifications, and I've always been interested in working with people from different cultural backgrounds, and in particular around cultural diversity. I have been reflecting both on my personal experiences and professionally that has brought me to where I am at the moment, leading cultural works and working in with others who work with children from culture and families from culturally diverse backgrounds. It's always been important to me that this cultural nuance and the cultural diversity. As a child, I have so many different memories where I remember thinking, I'm so proud of being my cultural traditions, my Greek traditions, but also feeling slightly uncomfortable with them at different times. In primary school, my mum and dad didn't speak English fluently, so when they enrolled me with a name called Getty, which literally was the expression of my colloquial Greek name, Getty, which I wasn't as comfortable with for many, many years, and changed in high school after I came back from living in Greece for a year then. And in my experience in living in Greece, where we decided to move back at one stage to try a different lifestyle, I remember visiting Greece and people called me a xeni, a stranger, somebody who didn't belong there. And I remember thinking, this is a bit weird. In Australia, I was growing up and I was referred to the non-Australian. And then I went back to Greece and I was referred to the non-Greek. And that was an unusual experience, or an experience which I had an aha moment of where do I belong and what culture do I belong to? Professionally, I have worked across many sectors, but always with children, young people and families and colleagues in human services. And I remember working in health and working with women who were going through health crisis, and talking to many Greek women as an interpreter and a social worker, and sharing with them conversations around their own personal needs, but also talking with professionals who were unintentionally making comments that suggested judgments around, oh, this is what Greek people do, or this is an attitude of having a Greek family in the health system. And it raised some questions to me around, professionally, how do we understand people from different cultural backgrounds? In health, it was very obvious through the language that we spoke to them, the importance of using interpreters. But it also highlighted some challenges in not understanding or making judgments around other assumptions of what we thought was important to people from different cultural backgrounds. And then 10 years ago, I had the good fortune of working and leading a child and family multicultural foster care program, one of the first of its kind in New South Wales, where I worked really closely with a very experienced and colleague who has influenced me significantly, Ghassan Nujam. And we collectively, together, we worked through an organisation called SSI to establish a multicultural program which tried to look at matching children from different cultural backgrounds with foster carers who shared the same cultures, and providing long-term foster care for children from culturally diverse backgrounds. And that was considered such a progressive program, and we were so committed to keeping children connected to their cultures. But this particular type of work is challenged with many different nuances. One, there aren't many foster carers or enough foster carers to be able to care for children, full stop, in Sydney and in Melbourne and internationally. And so finding carers who were culturally responsive was an area finding carers who shared the same cultures was one of our objectives, but also finding carers who were able to understand cultural differences and be able to support children from different cultures was our second objective. And in doing that, it raised a whole lot of questions around, what does culture actually mean? Does linking a child who's Arabic speaking with an Arabic speaking carer sufficient? Or linking an Arabic speaking child with an Arabic speaking caseworker or social worker, was that sufficient in being culturally responsive? And of course, that has strengths and it has value. But we started then questioning things such as, if we've placed this Arabic speaking child with an Arabic speaking carer, that Arabic speaking child's family is of a Christian faith and the Arabic speaking carer follow the Muslim faith, is that enough to think about in terms of a cultural connection? Or are we is it important to look at what other things are important for this child from a cultural lens? And what does that mean in terms of the experiences he or she will have with the carer that we've chosen? So we started really exploring, what does culture mean for children and families? And we started thinking more about the traditional ethnic traditions and heritage, and looking at language and religion as being important factors to think about when we're trying to understand culture and what it means for children and families. And over time, we also realised that the settlement journey, the migration and the refugee history also was important to understand what culture meant. Because for somebody who might be like myself, a second generation migrant, or for a newly arrived migrant, there may be similarities, but there may also be differences that need to be considered that are unique to our individual families. And the same in terms of the uniqueness of an experience for a child or a family who have been a refugee or an asylum seeker in terms of what their migration experience has been. So we realised that the issues around understanding culture from a practice perspective for children was really influenced by their settlement journey, their ethnicity, their language and their faith. And what that then suggested to us was some opportunities to really think through, do we actually know that when we're working with children and families? Do we have that information around children's settlement journey or their ethnicity or their language or their faith? And in fact, in my area of work of child and family, child protection and out of home care, we don't keep that data very well. We for a whole range of different reasons. There's an interest in doing it, but it's not a mandatory requirement. So what that means is that we're working with children and families from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, but we don't necessarily have the data on those nuanced cultural elements. And so it's been important to advocate for that work, and we're progressively moving forward in New South Wales. We're having in the recent years more conversations around how can we change, or what is it that we can do differently to try and understand those cultural elements around the families and the children that we're working with. And in doing that, we've actually called out 2 other areas of work that I think are just as important in improving how we're working with people from culturally different backgrounds. And one of those areas is what we call being culturally responsive, or looking at our cultural humility. As individual workers, as colleagues, how do we reflect on the ideas, our own histories of what's informed us around people's individual cultural experiences and cultural groups? What assumptions or judgments have influenced who we are? And how do we understand and explore that so that we can understand our own biases that we have? They may not be intended or deliberately stereotypical, but we all have biases around how we have been shaped, our history and our own views of our experiences with people from different cultures, or information that we've had from people from different cultures. That influences how we hear and receive information about people, but also what we expect around what we understand and how we expect people to behave. So that culturally responsive conversations that help us think about, as service providers, what we bring to the conversations we have with people from differences has been an important element to call out in my work, and creating opportunities for people to sit back and think about and talk about their own ideas and their own beliefs and values, and to be open to hear about how that might come across in the work that we do with individual children and families. So that's one element, that culturally responsiveness. And then the other element is around, at an organisational level, that we have been nurturing, is the importance at a strategy and an executive leadership perspective, and from a planning perspective, to be creating opportunities within the organisation to be mindful around the diversities of the workforce and the people we work with, to be calling out and be interested in calling out the data, making time and looking at how do we collect information that is culturally nuanced so that we can understand the cultural differences between the people that we're working with and the workforce. And how do we create the networks and the partnerships with other colleagues outside our organisation who are ethnic community leaders or who have more nuanced experiences with ethnic differences, so that we can partner with other organisations to develop our knowledge and to be able to shape our services in ways that can consider the expertise that other ethnic groups have. In New South Wales in particular, I think the experiences during COVID with the health department really highlighted the benefits of cultural partnerships, particularly in some areas where there were large demographic communities and who were not necessarily hearing the mainstream messages around vaccinations. Health, I think, really was progressive in its partnerships with different ethnic community groups and different ethnic leaders at that time to come together and to collectively and jointly talk to community groups of different ethnic backgrounds and share the credible knowledge of what we knew from a health perspective and the nuanced messages through ethnic leaders, faith-based leaders and community-based leaders collectively shared those messages around the vaccination at that time. And that partnership, I think, really helped influence how much people heard the messages around vaccination at that time. In child and family work, we've been able to nurture that from an organisational perspective. When you work with ethnic leaders or when you look at generic information around different cultures and you start demonstrating some awareness of information with a partner, but also some awareness of what is traditionally important in different countries, and you bring that to the table and you bring that to a dialogue, and you start having a conversation around, this is what I have heard, or this is what I understand about your particular ethnic background. Is that true? Is that meaningful for you? It allows for conversations to be nurtured in a way that then allows for conversations around, okay, so from a foster care perspective, what could this mean for this child? And how do we nurture those cultural experiences for a child in care? So from a strategic perspective, we need to be thinking about those resources and partnerships. From a staff and a leadership perspective, how do we nurture culturally responsive practices? And then from the direct service delivery, when we're working with children and families, be thinking about their ethnic traditions, their religious backgrounds, their language and their settlement journey. Not that they were going to group people, but it's prompts that around what we can have conversations with so that we can explore and think about what might be important for this family at this point in time, or what might be important information that traditionally was valuable that we may want to consider and nurture in to experiences that could lead to connections and ensure that we have that sense of belonging for children in care throughout their life while they're in care, and be in a good place for them to be able to reflect on and call on in as they move through to adult years.
So Kathy, you have such a fascinating story. You know, just listening to you speak, because we kind of come from a very similar background, knowing another language, living in another country. There's so many parallels, there's so many similarities. Your Churchill Fellowship in 2023 focused on multicultural foster care children. What specific practices or tools are you investigating to improve outcomes for these children?
Yeah, thanks, Gertrude. The practice tools we've developed in Sydney that I just spoke about, I use the concept of a self model, looking at when we're talking to families and children, looking at the lens of what does settlement mean for this child's family, what's important from a traditional perspective, what's important from a language, and what's important from a faith. They're practice tools that we're nurturing in New South Wales and in Sydney. What I'm hoping to understand from the countries I travel to, which at this stage are looking like Seattle in the States, Canada, Norway, and the UK, because they have a larger demographic population of diversity and they've had longer histories of working with children and families from diverse cultural backgrounds, I'm looking at what are the tools that they use when they're having conversations and when they're caring for children in foster care, long-term foster care. What approaches, what thinking, what practices have they been using that has a cultural lens that they've blended in with their commitments to permanency and stability in care? What approaches or what models have they used and influenced their staff to use and their carers to use? Is it a training perspective? Is it an approach to training and conversations that they nurture with staff? Is it an approach around training that they use with their foster carers to be helping them engage with cultural differences, if that's the case, if their children that they're caring for are from culturally different backgrounds? Is there training? Is there conversations? Are there tools that they use on a regular basis to prompt that thinking and prompt those connections? Is it work that they do with community connectors, or do they have links with the community that bring the children and involve them in communities so that the children have experiences, whether it's with celebrations of Eid or celebrations of Greek Orthodox Easter celebrations, or Hanukkah, or whatever it might be? Are there experiences that children have in the community that they're connected with other families who share cultural connections? So is it, what are the systems that they're using? What are the connections that they're doing? What are they doing on a consistent basis that allows cultural experiences for children?
Okay. So how does cultural responsiveness in services for children and families from diverse backgrounds lead to better outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Gertrude. The way we connect, the way we approach it, we being workers, staff, families, foster carers, if we have certain attitudes that we think some things aren't important, then we're not going to give children that experience. Often we might think, if we think that that what's only important is that the child disconnects from their history and learns to be, where we're providing safety and continuity, and the routines that we have might be important for us, and that therefore that's good enough for a child, we're limiting, our mindset and the way we think. We're going to limit that experience. And consistently we hear from children who turn 17, who turn 18, who are 20, and they come back and they say, when their carers have maintained connections for them and experiences of cultural activities. And I use an example of a young girl that I spoke to not that long ago. She said, "Thank you very much for connecting me with my African community and helping my foster mum learn how to braid my hair, and learn what creams were important for me to use on my skin when I was 12, 13, and learn that drumming and music in the family was something that's important in the African culture." When we were able to do that and introduce that to the foster carer, and the foster carer, who was a white Anglo, beautifully caring, beautifully loving mum that this young girl refers to as grandma, when she opened up her attitude and said, "Okay, that's important. I need to learn this for her, even though I don't think it's important, but for her, it might be important." And it was important to her. Being open to doing things differently than what I think might be important is one issue. And being open to exposing a child to different cultural experiences when the messages may not be obvious at a point in time. And I'll just use the example that we just talked about around our children learning to speak Greek, for example, my children learning to speak Greek at a young age, and they were terrible at it, and it didn't seem to be important. They're in their late teens now and early 20s, and I constantly get comments like, "Why didn't you force me to learn Greek? I want to learn Greek now." They didn't learn the language. They weren't exposed to it as much as what they could have been. But now they come back and say, "I want to learn it. I want to be connected to my culture." It might not have been obvious then. So it's about not necessarily making a judgment that because I can't see an outcome now, because I can't see the newborn child or the toddler listening to music from a different language being important, not to discount the impact that can have on building cultural experiences and cultural connections.
Now, in your role as a board member, how do you ensure that diversity and inclusion are prioritized in decision-making and organizational policies?
Yeah, thanks, Gertrude. And again, the opportunity as a board member, and my board colleagues will comment on this, is when they see me, they often say, I go to make a comment, they see my hand up, and they are constantly going, "Oh, we haven't looked at cultural diversity. Kathy's going to make a comment on it." The opportunity to encourage that thinking. Have we done enough to be aware
Yes.
of the diversity? Have we shared information that considers cultural diversity? Have we considered the information we're keeping around the children and families? So the data is the first issue that many of that we are thinking strategically. How can we shift and ensure that we are collecting information that raises our awareness of people from cultural diversity, in the same way that we are really mindful and doing well in identifying children or families or workers from First Nations, who are First Nations, or children or families or people who have disability or ability differences or gender differences. We're progressive in looking at other diversity issues, which are important. So recognising the importance of cultural nuances and how we can do that, and ensuring that we're sharing information and celebrating culture and cultural diversity so we can raise awareness.
Now, what barriers do multicultural families often face in accessing services, and how can these barriers be effectively addressed?
Yeah, thanks, Gertrude. And often the barriers are not, there's multi-layers to it, but one of them obviously is not knowing where services are. So being able to hear about services in language is one issue. Hearing about services through other ethnic specific organisations is often a place where agencies hear information from. Hearing information from family members, and hearing information, I think, from a broader perspective, where we have potential to shift the barriers, is sharing information and community education in partnership, where service providers are doing that in language with somebody who represents a different cultural background. And I'll give you one fantastic example where we did that really well. For families from multicultural, for families that we were interested in recruiting foster carers, we did community engagement conversations with the Muslim church leaders and Muslim community faith leaders, because they are conduits into the community. They're leaders that the community respects and values what they say. So sharing the messages with them allows for messages to be conveyed to community members and validated, and that is another way to break some of those barriers. And particularly, I was going to say, particularly, Gertrude, for many families from multicultural backgrounds, government services are not necessarily service providers that they, based on their history of how governments operate in their country of origin, they're not necessarily services that they want to trust, or they have images or perceptions of what government services do. So doing it collectively or in partnership with an ethnic or a cultural leader allows for some of those nuanced messages to be challenged and reframed.
I love that. So let's talk a little bit about the meaning of cultural communication and why it's important.
Yeah. And what that communication means, because it's more than just a language. It's nuances of words, it's nuances of dialect, it's nuances of who you hear it from. That question of who's the best person to hear that message from? Is it just the government? Is it from a community leader? Is it from your family member? Is it from your church? Is it through the radio, the newsletter? So where do you hear that information? And the nuances of words. So accent and dialect, I often talk about, we might speak English with a group of community members, but if one person's Irish, the other person's Scottish, the other person's from UK, the other person's from the States, and the other person's from New Zealand, we all may speak English, but the dialect takes us a little bit of time to understand.
Yes.
In that sense. So the way we hear accent is important, and the way we communicate. So in some communities, it's important to show signs of respect, to bow, or to greet people in a particular way, to take your shoes off go into somebody's home. So learning some of those traditions that allow for communication to be nurtured, which shows that you respect and you're wanting to understand somebody else's way of communicating, can be important.
It's absolutely cool. My last question for you is, what advice would you give to service providers and leaders who are working to make their organizations more culturally responsive and inclusive?
Yeah. And it's not I think one thing I'd like to say is people from culturally diverse backgrounds are as diverse as they are common, have as many diverse differences as they have similar elements. We all share many things that are similar, and we all share things that are different. So families from Africa or Spain may have similarities, and they will all have their own nuances and differences. Recognizing that diversity is important. So if you can keep data, do what you can to look at what systems you currently have. How can you adjust them to be able to look at differences will be helpful. Take time out to think and reflect on the way you come across and what you bring to the conversations. And check things out with people. Ask information, whether it's with a community leader, somebody within your organization that shares a cultural element. Seek information out so that you can use that as a starting point.
Kathy, I could talk to you forever around this subject. As you know, this is a passion speaking point for me. And it's just wonderful to hear it from your perspective. It's a real celebration of our differences. And for us to have that ability just to embrace those differences and see them as a strength and not a weakness.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for coming online and sharing this amazing story with us today.
Thank you, Gertrude.
And thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. The Diversity Connector is bringing you stories, different viewpoints from people from all over the world. Tune in again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world, and bye for now. Thanks again, Kathy.
Bye.
And that's a wrap, everybody, on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open, and definitely